Last time we were in 1 Samuel, God gave the nation of Israel a great victory against the Philistines because of the faith of Prince Jonathan, the son of King Saul. Jonathan was able, with just his armor bearer, able to kill 20 Philistines, which led to a domino effect of the Philistines being routed and defeated to the point where the Israelites were able to drive them back a great deal. Saul, instead of thanking God for this great victory and continuing in obedience to him, does something incredibly ridiculous. And it illustrates a very interesting dynamic, and it's something that we need to safeguard in our own lives and be aware of it because it might happen all around us. Okay, so if you remember, we're in 1 Samuel chapter 14. In the previous chapter, Saul screws up royally, and he disobeys Samuel and offers up the sacrifice instead of waiting for Samuel to come because he was afraid and he saw the people scattering. So Samuel rebuked Saul and told him, "You've lost the kingdom. It's going to someone else." And now Saul is in a bad place. And as I said before, we see a rapid decline in Saul's leadership and his decisions. From this point on, it's going to get worse and worse, and he becomes a very dark man with a very dark and tragic end. But in the middle of this, in chapter 14, we see this amazing victory because Jonathan, the prince, very much unlike his father, steps out in faith with just his armor bearer and goes and approaches the Philistines saying, "Hey, if God is with us, we're going to win no matter how many people we have." And just the two of them kill 20 men, send the entire Philistine army, which is tens of thousands of soldiers, into complete confusion. And that causes the rest of Israel to rally together and storm the camp. And if the Philistines are fighting each other, there's confusion. God sends an earthquake. In verse 23, it ends saying, "So the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle moved beyond Beth Aven," which meant the Israelites are pushing back the Philistines and gaining more ground. This is an amazing moment. And I mentioned this illustrates not Saul's obedience or anything Saul's done, but the fact that Jonathan somehow is so different than his father because he has faith in God and he stepped out in that faith and God gave him an amazing deliverance. Now I'm going to continue in verse 24. I'm going to move a little bit slowly, and there's something I want to bring to light in this passage. But it's something that does happen amongst God's people, and it could happen in our own life, it could happen in a corporate setting, and we need to watch it and guard against this kind of thing in order that God can continue to do a good work in our life. So we're in chapter 14 of 1 Samuel, verse 24. "Now the men of Israel were in distress that day, for Saul had placed the troops under an oath, saying, 'Cursed is a man who eats any food before evening, before I have taken vengeance on my enemies.' So none of the troops tasted any food." So let's stop right here. This is ridiculous. I don't know if you've ever been in an army. I've never been in an army, but I'm familiar with the concept. And there's one thing that you need for soldiers to have strength to defeat their enemy, and it's food. You need training, you need equipment, you need strategy, you need all these things, but the soldiers need to have something on their stomachs or they're going to have no strength. But idiot Saul says something that makes absolutely no sense, and it's extremely telling about his heart. Now, when we first met Saul, I talked about how this man has an enormous insecurity. He is suffering from this fear of men. If you remember, the Bible said he was head and shoulders taller than any other person in Israel. He was a beautiful man, a strong, imposing man. In fact, the Bible says he came from a wealthy, prominent family in the tribe of Benjamin. But yet when we meet him, he says, "I'm nothing. I'm not important. I'm not important amongst Israel. Why are you talking to me, Samuel?" And God says all these amazing things to Saul about his future. God picked him out of all of Israel to be the first king. But yet Saul thinks of himself as nothing. Now, that's not humility. That is a sign that he is cherishing the praise and approval of men. When you compare yourself to other people, when you seek and crave the approval of other people, you're always going to fall short because very few people are willing to shower praise on anyone else because they're so insecure themselves. So when you seek the praise of men and you don't get it, you're totally empty. And the word I would put to describe Saul, now we have to understand that Saul was a man chosen by God. And we still have to respect him because anytime God places his attention on someone, it's for a reason, and we should still respect this man because of the important role he played in Israel and the role he played in God's plan. Not because we love Saul, we don't even know him, but we love and respect God and honor what he does. So when I say this, I'm not trying to be dismissive of Saul or insulting to Saul. I'm trying to be honest. But Saul was a coward. All right, the fear of man produces cowardice. We see that throughout his entire life, that he was constantly worried about what other people thought of him. He couldn't stand up to the Israelites who grumbled against him, even though God said he is the king. And we saw in the last chapter when the people were scattering, he was so worried about losing them and losing their favor and their attention that he broke the agreement we had with Samuel and offered the sacrifices that Samuel was supposed to offer, because he was so worried about what other people thought of him. He craved that approval. Now in verse 24, you might think, well, that's the opposite. Now Saul's being a complete jerk. Well, ironically, the outward or inverse of fear of men or cowardice is bullying. If you ever grew up and you've dealt with bullies, you probably heard in one way or the other your parents or someone saying, they only do that because they're insecure or they're just jealous of you or something like that. Now, when I was growing up, I dealt very little with bullies because I always just kind of stood up to them. Not because I was so amazing, I just had zero tolerance or fear from them, so I pushed back. And sometimes I got in little scrapes, but I had very few problems with bullies because when you stand up to them, it's exposing their real motive, which is, I'm afraid of you. Most of the time, bullies are terrified of the people they're bullying. Now, how can that be? It's because there's something about that person or group of people that they are envious of. Okay, they can't see the good things that God has put into their life, the talents, the intelligence, the skill, the good things. And so they crave and are jealous of what other people have, and that makes them angry, and even makes them angry that they're angry, and angry that they're insecure. And so instead of becoming friends with those people, or wanting to learn from those people, or enjoy what they have, they attack them, hoping that if I can intimidate them, beat them up, they won't be as special as they are, and I'll feel good about myself. That's bullying. That's cowardice reflected outwardly. It's fear of men. And so Saul here, he's doing the same thing he's always done. He's trying to overcompensate for his own insecurities and fears by acting like a complete moron. And when I say moron and idiot, I'm not trying to be insulting. I'm trying to be very direct. This is how he's acting. It makes no sense for him to do what he just did. We know the practical reasons, but there's more to it than that. Notice what he says here. So Saul was given by God this victory. He did nothing to earn the victory that we read about in the earlier verses. It was Jonathan stepping out by faith, and then God sends an earthquake, and all the Israelites come out and start fighting and rallying together. So God did it. God did it through Jonathan and other people. But now suddenly Saul is taking credit for something he had nothing to do with. And this victory given to him by God puffs him up, and now he's suddenly acting like a big tough man. Just a few days ago, he was terrified of the people leaving him. Now he's bullying them, pushing them around, like, you better not eat any food. And notice what he says here. Before I have taken vengeance on my enemies. Whoa, hold up, Saul. Your enemies? Your vengeance? Since when was this ever about you? If you remember in the previous chapters when God chose Saul, Samuel said, God has chosen you to be the deliverer of his people against the Philistines. Saul was just a servant. He was just an instrument by God to help the people who had a great need. But now Saul's talking like it's all about him. My vengeance on my enemies. What vengeance? What did they do to you? In fact, Saul was king. Out of anyone in Israel, he was living the high life. He had servants and he had a great estate. He was able to take taxes from the people and build his own army. If anyone was sitting pretty right now, it was Saul. This has nothing to do with the Philistines coming against Saul. It's the Philistines taking lands and territory from Israel. The Israelites couldn't even have a blacksmith to make tools because of the way the Philistines were harassing them. They would have taken their land, taken their farms, they would have killed them. They may have even taken their wives for themselves, subjected the men and the children to slavery. It's the people that are being harassed, not Saul. And notice he says, I take vengeance. What does the word of God say? Vengeance is mine, declares the Lord. It's not our job to get vengeance against our enemies. It's our job to be obedient to the Lord and trust that he's the one who has our back. He's the one that's going to take care of them. But yet Saul is making it all about himself. And to the point where he says something so ridiculous, so foolish that he's actually hurting the people that are there to help him. So that may seem obvious, but let's take a look at the next few verses. Then all the troops entered the forest, and there was honey on the ground. And when they entered the forest and saw the flowing honey, not one of them put his hand to his mouth because they feared the oath. So this is amazing. You may have remembered back in the time of Moses, God said, this land is flowing with milk and honey. Well, here it is. It's literally flowing with honey. I've never been to a forest full of beehives. I've seen, beekeepers and the things that they do, and you've probably seen that on TV or whatever. You may have seen commercials that have like Honey Nut Cheerios, and you see that little honeycomb and it's just dripping with honey. And it's like, if you're hungry, you're like, oh, that looks delicious. I can't imagine what it was like in this moment. There was so much honey, it was literally flowing down the beehives, down the trees into their path. And that could have been because the Philistines had been cracking open beehives. I don't know. But the fact of the matter is there was just food waiting there for them to take. And you have to keep in mind that they had just defeated the Philistines and were pillaging them and taking their armor and swords. So the men who didn't have any weapons now had weapons. They were carrying all this heavy armor and gear on their back, not eating anything all day. There would have been food and supplies in the Philistines' camp they could have taken, but Saul said, no, you can't take it. And here it is, God providing them this fresh source of food and energy, which proves that no matter what, God's going to provide. And if you think about it, Saul may have made that stupid oath out of fear. They could have found all this food and all this plunder from the Philistines, but maybe he thought, whoa, if we eat all of it now, we might run out. And it may have been based on fear, or may have been based on greed. This is all mine. You can't eat this. This is for me. But regardless of the situation, God was still providing for them. There's literally trees flowing with honey. All the men could have taken their fill, gotten enough energy to keep marching. This shows you the level of arrogance and pride that this bully has, that even as God is providing this fresh source of food, literally rivers of honey, they can't even eat. So what happens next? Jonathan, however, had not heard that his father had charged the people with the oath. So he reached out the end of his staff in the honey, dipped it in the honeycomb, and put his hand to his mouth, and his eyes brightened. Then one of the soldiers told him, your father bound the troops with an oath, saying, cursed is the man who eats food today. That's why the people are faint. My father has brought trouble to the land, Jonathan replied. Just look at how my eyes have brightened because I tasted a little of this honey. How much better would it have been if the troops had eaten freely today from the plunder they took from their enemies? Would not the slaughter of the Philistines have been much greater? So here we see, apparently because Jonathan was out doing all the amazing things that we read about, he didn't hear his father say this stupid thing. Now, chances are his father said this after the victory. It's important to keep in mind because this follows after the events we just read. So God had already given them this victory. They already were pushing forward to defeat the rest of the Philistines. Then Saul says this really stupid thing. You could say God was already moving, doing something very important. And then Saul steps in and makes it complicated. He complicates the issue. And you see what Jonathan says. If we were able to eat freely, we would have had a greater victory because all the people would have food in their bellies and they could have fought. Jonathan says here, he's basically saying, my father screwed up big time. And you might be wondering, what is the significance of this? What does this mean for us? I don't really understand. Obviously, it just shows you how Saul is being foolish and it's hurting the Israelites. Well, there's something here that's worth noting, and I'm going to try to articulate it as best I can. It's something that we should recognize in our own lives and perhaps in our churches and our organizations in order for us to be truly in tune with what God's doing. So, like we said, God was doing this amazing thing. Saul had nothing to do with it because of his disobedience. Then when Saul sees something good happening, he steps in and kind of tramples all over it with this idiotic vow that made it harder for the Israelites to continue to experience this victory God had given them. And then we read later on, we'll get to hopefully in the future, what happens as a result of this because of Saul's foolish actions. There are times you may have experienced this or you may not have recognized what it was, but there are times when God is doing something very legitimate in a person's life or in a church's life, in an organization or in a country. It might actually be something miraculous like signs and wonders, or there might be some outpouring of evangelism and growth. The church's ministries might be taking off, or might be something really profound and unique in your own life. But then someone comes along and tries to get their hands on it, and they manhandle it and ruin it because they want to make it about themselves. The best analogy I could give you for this kind of dynamic is, you've probably experienced this. You're with a group of friends and everyone's having a good time and someone says something funny and the whole group just bursts out laughing. It's just this contagious laughter because they said just the perfect thing at just the perfect moment. But then some knucklehead in the group wants to add to it and they trample all over the joke and they're like, yeah, because of da 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 da, and they completely deflate the moment. They ruin the joke or they try to add to it, making it worse. And everyone's kind of like, and the moment is ruined. We've all been there. Sometimes we may have been the one who did it. But that's what I'm trying to convey is happening here. And it happens all the time in churches and in groups. God does something so special. And when God does something, we need to keep our hands off of it. Because it's not about us. The Bible says we have this treasure, okay, the grace of God, His Word, in earthen vessels, so that we recognize that it's coming from God and not from ourselves. Paul often said this. He talked about the wonders and splendor of the gospel, but then he often went out of his way to show how unworthy he was to preach it. He said he used to be a violent aggressor against the church. He said, I was the least of all the apostles. I faced shipwrecks and beatings, and I have no power within myself, because all the glory belonged to the Lord. But in the church world today, we have something so special from God, the truth of salvation, the gospel of the Jesus Christ, our risen Lord and Savior. All we have to do is speak it and let God do amazing things in our midst, in our communities, in our lives. But instead, we have to grab hold of it and control it. One of the ways we do this is with pet doctrine or pet theology. It's a term I've used occasionally on the show. Pet doctrine isn't actual biblical truth. It's things we've decided were true based on what we were raised to believe or whatever church we went to, or things we're reading into scripture that isn't there, but that we hold on to it like a pet, something that we treasure that's more important than the truth. And we'll cling to that even when the Bible's telling us sometimes the opposite, because we want it, we control it. This pet doctrine is more important to us than what God is showing us in the Word. In other ways, when people try to make something from God about themselves. When I went to college, I was going to a church where historically, in the recent history of the church, God did amazing things through people and through the community, and people around the world would visit this church and be touched by God. But over time, the people convinced themselves these good things are happening because of them, because they prayed a certain amount or did these types of things or did the right things, and then all of this wonderful stuff from God was about them. And big surprise, people's eyes got taken off of the Lord and onto a church or an organization or a person or a group of people. And that had nothing to do with what God was doing. As Jonathan said here, if his father had not made that rash vow, if he did not make this event about himself, we would have had a greater victory. This can happen in small communities. This can happen in our own personal life. I've heard stories about people who've come to Christ in this amazing way. You know, they're in the world, they're in sin, they're in darkness, and then either they read a Bible or a tract or a friend told them about Jesus, and the Lord just opened their eyes, and they're just filled with this wonder and joy of salvation. And then they go to church, and they're surrounded by church people, and all the negativity, all the gossip, all the selfishness, all the pride of these toxic, unhealthy church communities nearly stamps out this person's enthusiasm for the Lord. And this, sadly, is something that happens quite a bit. We have churches, we have communities that say they're Christian. They have crosses on the wall. The sign says Christian, church, evangelistic, Episcopal, Methodist, whatever. And you expect to go in there and meet people that are full of the love of God. And instead, it's like walking into a funeral. The people eye you suspiciously. Oh, you're sitting in my seat. And they don't like the way you look. They don't like the way you dress. They literally carry Bibles in their hands, but in their eyes are daggers because you're so different or you're new or they don't like you or they don't want you in their church. What a disgrace. What a disgrace to the God who sent his Son to suffer and die for us. What a disgrace of the wonderful grace he's given us, the Holy Spirit who opens our eyes to his truth, the love he poured into our hearts. He's giving us these rivers of honey to freely eat from, with no restriction, so that everyone can partake and everyone can be blessed, for all of our eyes, so to speak, to be brightened to the truth. But yet we are deliberately preventing people from experiencing God because of our pride, because of our selfishness, because of our wickedness, because of our fear of men, because of our selfish desires. It's no different than what Jesus said about the Pharisees and the religious leaders of his day. These were men, they dressed the part. They looked so religious and so godly. They built entire synagogues for the people to come and worship and hear the Lord, hear the word of the Lord. But Jesus said, these are blind men leading the blind. They're whitewashed tombs full of dead bones. They were preventing people from coming to know the Lord. All of Israel at that time were crying out for the Messiah. They were eager to know God, but the Pharisees and the rabbis were lying to them, putting on them heavy burdens that made knowing God a miserable task. Have you ever been around people who think they have to earn their place with God through works, through the law? They're miserable. Every little thing has to be stressed over. Well, can I say this? Can I do this? Can I eat this? Can I go there? And then they reflect that misery onto you. They're judgmental. They're critical. It's because in their heart, they're so afraid of failing that they project that fear onto you through hate, through criticism, through anger, through snide little comments, through gossip. And it becomes a sick, disgusting situation. That's exactly what Saul was doing in this moment. It's exactly what the false rabbis and teachers were doing in Jesus' day, which is the reason why he rebuked them so harshly. And it's what's going on in churches all over the world. God wants to do something amazing in our midst. I started this podcast because I believe the Lord is coming back very soon. I don't know when, but it could be at any moment, so we can't waste our time. But yet there's churches all over America and so many places around the world that are just like Saul. They are pushing their agenda, their pride, their selfishness onto the things of God and preventing people from tasting and seeing that the Lord is good. And this looks different in different situations. It might not always be the same thing, but it's people putting themselves ahead of God. Now, the good news is, of course, that it doesn't stop God from accomplishing his task. And there will be people like Jonathan who will step up and say, no, this is the right thing to do. But as we see later on, we'll get to, hopefully in the future, that Jonathan faced intense consequences for what he did. And when you want to stand up and serve the Lord, when you want to step out in ministry or be a witness or pray more or read the Bible or speak or serve, there are not just going to be sinful, worldly people that oppose you. There might be people in the church, Christian elders, leaders, who don't want you doing that. Because you're taking the focus off of them, their programs, their ministries, their organizations, and onto God. You're not doing it for yourself. You see God is doing something. Look at these rivers of honey. Let's partake. Look at how my eyes have been brightened. That term is used deliberately here. It's your eyes, spiritual eyes being opened. And you're seeing more of God. And you're experiencing more of God. And you're reading the Word. And you're drinking from that well of living water. And you want the people around you to also partake. That's what Jonathan's saying. Like, look, there's the honey. Let's eat, let's drink, let's enjoy, let's keep going. But there will be people that say, no, that's not how we do things around here. Did you hear about so-and-so? And they'll try to inject you with their poison and their pride and to try to bring you down to their dark level. Now, I can't say these people are believers or not. Jesus said they're going to be tares among the wheat. They're going to be weeds among the actual wheat of believers. And we don't know their heart. But we need to be aware of this kind of behavior, so that we are not intimidated by this kind of thing. I'm not saying you need to rebel against a pastor that you disagree with, because just because you disagree with them doesn't mean that they're attacking you. But if you're in an environment where they're trying to stamp you down, maybe you shouldn't be in that environment. Or maybe you should recognize what's happening and, like Jonathan, stand up and say, no, this is what the Word of God says, and this is what we're going to do. That may cause them to persecute you or say bad things about you, but you need to obey God rather than the religious, wicked, demonic actions of sinful people who call themselves believers. But more importantly, okay, because it's kind of an easy solution, right? Just leave that church. I mean, I don't encourage people just fleeing churches from one church to another, but unfortunately, if that is the case, you might have no choice. Or you might stand up and say, no, this is what we need to do. And enough people will wake up like you, will take a taste of that honey, their eyes will be opened, and you all say, yes, this is what we need to do. And the people trying to discourage them will repent, their hearts will be pierced, they will recognize that they were wrong, and then we all can move forward in God. That would be a wonderful situation. That might not be the case. But more than that, we need to recognize, are we like Saul? Now, this might not happen if you just came to the Lord and you're brand new and you're just learning about who God is for the first time. But over the course of years, you might end up in this mindset. You might begin to think that it's really about you. It's about what you have to say, what you have to do. This is true for pastors and leadership in church, but it could happen to anyone in Christ, any Christian, anywhere. It's because the root of it is we're not allowing God to work deeper in our life. This is the process of sanctification, spiritual maturity. As we journey in God, he's going to go deeper in our life. Jesus used the parable of the seed being sown, and some of that seed becomes roots that go deep down into the soil, but sometimes there's rocks in that soil that prevent the roots from going down deep. So what's the solution? You got to get rid of the rocks. You got to allow God to pulverize those rocks into soil so that the roots can go down deeper. That is the process of sanctification. It's sometimes painful. It sometimes requires you to look at yourself honestly and say, you know what? I'm fearing men more than I am trusting and loving God. I care so much about the pride and praise of men that it's causing me to say and do all these terrible things. Or maybe I'm so concerned with my place in the church and the community that when I see new people coming, I'm whispering against them or attacking them or criticizing them. That's got to stop. Or maybe you see your church growing and going to directions you don't like, and you're going to put your foot down and say, no, that's not how we did it, because you're afraid. You're afraid of what God might do next. That's because you're trusting in your circumstances and your comforts rather than being trusting in the Lord and all the good things he has for you. No matter what the case is, we might find ourselves looking like Saul and saying, no, I am not going to allow God to move. I'm going to prevent people from eating what God is providing for them. Just like the blind leading the blind, just like the Pharisees who are stopping people from entering into the gates of the kingdom. But the solution is simple. Peter says, humble yourself before the Lord, and he will raise you up in the due time, casting all your cares on him because he cares for you. You got to be humble. And it's not an easy thing. Okay, the Bible says humble yourself. It's a choice of saying, not me, you. Jesus said that in the garden. He said, Lord, if you could pass this cup for me, please do it, but not my will, yours be done. But there's also a deeper process. Humbling yourself is painful. Humbling yourself isn't what our flesh wants. Humbling yourself might cost you something. It might mean you don't get to do what you hoped you wanted to do. Years ago, when I graduated high school, I went to Bible college. I was convinced or very eager that I was going to become a preacher or a pastor or an evangelist of some kind. But after I graduated college, I decided that's not what I wanted because I just couldn't turn my faith into a job. Not that there's anything wrong with full-time ministry or teaching. I just saw so many people who were making it about themselves, and I said, I can't do this. I don't want to do this. But my desire to serve the Lord wasn't in any way diminished. I just couldn't do what I saw so many other people doing. So instead, for 20 years, I was in secular work. I was a web designer, a graphic designer. Now I'm a writer. And I went through a journey where God was the one humbling me. If I had it my way, I would have immediately jumped into full-time ministry, and who knows what would have happened. I would have been puffed up, full of pride. I would have made it about myself. I would try to build up this ministry or church and made it all about me. But God was gracious, and he brought me through a series of seasons where I was humbled, where I realized it wasn't about me. It wasn't about my job. It wasn't about my service. It wasn't about whatever I knew. So he could break up those rocks that needed to be removed so that the roots can go down deeper. So now I'm still far from where I need to be. We're all growing. But hopefully I'm a little more humble than I was before. And in any way God chooses to use me, I could recognize this has nothing to do with me. Any wisdom or intelligence or any good thing I have has nothing to do with me. It's just about Jesus. So that he could work through me, so that his rivers of water can feed the thirsty and touch parched, dry ground for the benefit of those people, not so that I could be puffed up like Saul and say, yeah, it's me. I did it. These are my enemies, my vengeance, or my ministry, or my church. So when we humble ourselves, when we say to the Lord, not my will, but yours be done, he will take us through a process of sanctification, and he will poke his finger right on those nerves that we don't want to get touched. No, God. Yeah, you could have this part of my life, you could have this part of my life, but don't you touch this one, because that's off limits. Well, if you think that way, and sometimes we're not even conscious of us thinking that way, you are not allowing God to have his work in your life. And over time, that problem's not going to get better. It's going to get worse. And you might find yourself so hardened in a particular sin that you're just like Saul. You're preventing other people from experiencing God. So the solution, my friend, is to daily die. You might not even know the areas that need to change, but God does. And he said, I am gentle and humble. My yoke is easy. It's not going to be something that you can't do. It's something it's impossible for you to do. It's something that God's going to do through you. And he does it with grace. He does it with love. It may feel painful at times. It might be uncomfortable. It might not be what you want. But what it ends up producing, as the Bible says, is the peaceful fruit of righteousness. You'll be like Jonathan. You'll be like Samuel. You'll be like David. You won't be like Saul. Next episode, Lord willing, we'll move on and see how Saul's ignorance and sin created even more problems for Jonathan and for the nation. Thank you for listening to the Lightning Podcast. Every episode and every other content is on lightningpodcast.org, as well as every major podcast platform.